Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Lucy, an Australian piano accordionist. I've been playing the piano accordion for 10 years. I'm here to inspire you and help you learn to play. But today we're talking all things busking. This is the third video in a series on busking. My first video was the pros and cons of busking. My second video was your checklist for busking. If you'd like to check out those videos, you can do so clicking up here. This video today is all about location. What's the best location that you should busk in? Even after 10 years of busking, I still get nervous when I'm about to perform somewhere new. Some places just feel like they were made for me, and other places make me feel completely invisible, and I just never know how it's going to turn. But over the years, I have made some observations about places that tend to perform better for me and places that tend to perform not so well in terms of the amount of tips I receive. If you've had a busking experience where you haven't received many tips, don't be discouraged by this. Sometimes it is just the wrong location. I'm going to discuss the difference between playing in big cities, playing in small communities, outside of cafes, restaurants, grocery stores, nightclubs. Now, I have to just mention I play the piano accordion, so this information is all coming from the perspective of a piano accordionist. I can't speak for other acts like juggling or art or a singer, songwriter playing their guitar. I don't know what it's like to be an entertainer of that kind. I can only speak from the perspective of being a piano accordionist. But I hope you find this video relevant to whatever your act is. Let's get straight into it. So is it better to busk in a busy location? This was an assumption I made early on, that the more people around would equal more tips. That hasn't necessarily been the case from my experience. I started busking in my small community and was averaging about $60 Australian per hour. I was really excited to get to Melbourne, which is a much bigger city with way more people and crowds I could potentially be performing for. So I got my permit, I took the 1 hour train to get to Melbourne, and I had my first busking stint in the city, and it was awful. I moved around multiple places trying to find a better spot, but after the whole hour had gone by, I'd made $15, which was just a fraction of what I'd been making in Geelong. Now, in Melbourne, there are tons of buskers everywhere, so it's obviously working for some people, or they wouldn't be doing it. So I'm going to discuss some of the reasons why I think it may not have worked for me a little bit later on in this video. I've also had this same experience when I lived in the US. I was living in North Carolina for a few years and experimented with busking in big cities versus small towns. And the big cities, although there was so much foot traffic and people passing me by, no one seemed to want to tip me. And then when I went busking in the smaller town, I got so much more interaction and positive feedback from people and a lot more tips. So it really seems that there is much more to consider than the amount of foot traffic when deciding the best location to busk. Consider the famous busking experiment in 2007. The Washington Post published an article about an experiment in which Grammy Award-winning violinist Joshua Bell busked in a busy DC metro subway. In the entirety of his 43-minute performance, 1,097 people passed him by, and of those people, only 27 people tipped him. That's just 2%. He made a total of $32 for that entire performance, which is just a fraction of the amount of money that he made 3 days prior performing that same repertoire in a concert. This really is all the evidence you need that busking is all about location and not necessarily about the talent of the performer. And if you have a bad experience, don't take it too personally. So why is this the case? Why are these really busy places the worst spots to busk? Well, cities are loud. You're competing with trains, buses, trams if you're in Melbourne. You've also got music coming from nearby stores. There's lots of conversation, people talking around you, and you also have competition from other buskers. I know in Melbourne, sometimes there's a busker on every single corner, and trying to find a spot where there's not lots of competing music, it's actually quite difficult. So when I tried busking in Melbourne, I was competing with so much noise that people could only hear me for a few seconds only as they were directly passing me. People couldn't hear me from a distance. They couldn't hear me play a song start to finish. They were getting like 5-second glimpses of my music because there was so much other noise. You really need to play with amplification if you're going to play in a really large city like that, depending on what instrument you're playing. For me, the accordion just wasn't loud enough. If I ever tried busking in the city again, I would definitely consider bringing amplification. However, in Melbourne, there are restrictions on where you can play amplified. Herd mentality. Herd mentality is the idea that people's behaviors can be influenced by the behaviors of their peers, which is exactly what I notice when I'm busking. When there are large crowds of people walking past when I start, people are reluctant to be that first person to stop and tip. But once somebody does, it's a lot easier for everyone else to do so. But you can imagine when there are more crowds of people, it is more intimidating for that first person to be the one to step forward and put money in the case. Whereas when there's not so many people around, they feel less like they need to just sort of fit in with the crowd. As soon as one person stops, other people stop, and then before you know it, you've got a crowd in front of you. It was never going to happen until that one person decided to be the first one to do something different. Let's talk about the difference between tourists versus locals. There's a big, important distinction between the people that make up the population of a big tourist hub and people that make up the population of a smaller, tight-knit community. Tourists are usually in a certain city for a certain amount of time. They're just passing through, they're taking in all the sights of the city, and you're just part of that experience, and I feel like you're just more likely to be taken for granted. That person's potentially moving on to a different city or maybe even a different country the next day. They're not really interested in whether or not you're going to return. They're not really invested in the culture of that city. They kind of just take you in as part of the site and then they move on. I've had large groups of tourists stop and take selfies with me and then tip me less than $1. Smaller communities are full of people that are just delighted to see you contributing your art to the place that they call home. When they tip you, they're not only just showing you gratitude for you being there in that moment, but they're encouraging you to return. It's the place that they live, so they want to show you their appreciation. And these are the places where I have people stop and tell me, "Thank you for coming here, please come back." I just busked at a market yesterday where I had a woman come up to me and tell me this was a market that she'd been coming to for 20 years, and hearing me play Italian music just connected her and her friends to their Italian culture, and she really appreciated that I was there. She was so grateful and she wanted to make sure I could come back, and I explained to her that this was a market that I actually needed to book a spot to busk, so I couldn't just come every day. So she went out and actually contacted the event organizers to tell them to let me come back and that I was bringing so much to their community. Okay, let's move on to venues now. Let's talk about some of the different venues that I've busked at and my experiences. Let's start with cafes. Cafes can be a really good spot to busk because it's an opportunity to play for people for more than the 30 seconds that they're passing you by. They're sitting down outside to have a meal. They can actually listen to an entire set of your repertoire. These people I've found are more likely to want to show their appreciation because they've been able to enjoy you for a longer amount of time. I've had people tip me much more generously from cafes. For example, I've played outside of cafes where there's only 2 people, which, you know, when you set up and you're only playing for 2 people, sometimes it can feel a little bit like, what's the point? There's no one here. But those 2 people could tip you more than like the next 20 people walking past because they really appreciate what you contributed to their day. I want to mention though, you want to have extensive repertoire, because if you go busking with 5 songs and it's like a transit zone where people are just moving to and from, that's fine. But if you're going to do that outside of a cafe, you're just going to annoy everybody because they're going to get sick of listening to the 5 songs on repeat. Also judge if you're playing on private business property or on the public footpath or sidewalk. You don't want to step on the business's toes. It's also a good opportunity to check the conditions of your busking permit. Some will actually have regulations for the exact measurements of how close you can be, like what exact distance you can be from the shop front. Also, don't play outside of a cafe that already has music playing over a speaker. You're obviously just going to annoy everybody. If you do this right, you may even have the venue ask you to come and play inside. I have had this happen to me multiple times, but every single time they've offered to pay me less money than I was making busking, so I've always declined it. And sometimes the venue will even feed you or give you food and drink. I've had many venues come out and hydrate me on hot days or like give me snacks. There's even one venue that I play outside of in Geelong sometimes. It's an area where I walk around, I stroll around, but he's always like, no, I want you outside my venue. And he will give me food and drink and like do anything to keep me happy because he knows it's free entertainment for his customers. All right, grocery stores. This is a great place to busk. I love to play outside of grocery stores because it's a boring, mundane task for most people to go grocery shopping. So if you set up outside of the door where they're bagging up their groceries or going through the checkout, you're going to be able to make that really boring task an enjoyable one for them. I've actually had people come to me and thank me for making the really mundane task of grocery shopping more enjoyable. People can also plan their tip more in advance. Like people walking by sometimes, like you'll see them feel their pockets and they like don't have money. But people in a grocery store, they can take the change and reserve it for you and actually plan to tip you when they come out. One of the best busking experiences I had was in 2014. I was in Australia and I was busking outside of a grocery store on Christmas Eve. Everyone gave me their change. I made $200 in 1 hour. Don't be offended if the shop asks you to leave. That has happened to me before. They're usually polite about it, and as long as you're polite about it too, like it doesn't have to be a terrible thing. You just move on and play somewhere else. There was a grocery store I used to play outside of regularly, but then they had a blanket ban because they had some people set up outside the grocery store and try to sell things, and then they had complaints from customers, so then they just had a rule that no one could perform or try and sell anything outside of the grocery store. You will find that the good places to busk often attract people that are selling things or raising money for charity, so it can get quite competitive. Let's talk about banks and ATMs. Now, I actually did this by accident. I wasn't actually setting up outside of banks and ATMs because I just wanted everyone to like withdraw their life savings and tip it to me. I just happened to be there because it was just the best spot. But what I noticed was people would go to the ATM, and the ATM outside of that particular bank always had a queue on the weekend. There was always people lining up. This was like pre-COVID where people used a lot of cash, but the world is kind of changing now. But people were lining up for the ATM, enjoying my music, and then when they were done with their transaction, they'd give me a little bit of it. Okay, let's talk about nightclubs. This is definitely a place where I busk the least. I had just seen other people doing it outside of nightclubs, like playing harmonica and guitar, things like that. And I was like, I'm gonna give that a go. So one night I woke myself up at 3 a.m. in the morning. I had a male friend come with me as security. I stood outside of this nightclub that closed at 3 a.m. on the dot. And I just started playing anything. I think it was just French waltzes. That's what I was playing mostly at the time. And everyone spilled out of this nightclub and was like waiting for taxis. And people were just dumping like the entire contents of their wallets into my case. I mean, people were literally leaving credit cards. I had to chase people down. I had someone give me $50. I tried to give it back because I did feel a little guilty about people maybe making decisions they wouldn't ordinarily make because they were under the influence of alcohol. So that's also something to consider, like how does it sit with you morally to be taking money off drunk people, even if they're giving it to you. But this particular person insisted on giving me the $50, so I ended up taking it in the end. And after 20 minutes of playing, I'd made $150. It was pretty amazing. I think I did it one other time and made $100. It's not something I would do again though, because I really enjoy the connection and the community and the conversations that come along with busking. It's not just all about the money for me, and I just felt like it wasn't the most rewarding thing. Like, I like to play for people who are sober and, you know, can like properly enjoy and listen to the music. I felt like they were tipping me more because of the novelty of seeing an accordionist outside of a nightclub, and less so for actually like appreciating the music. If you are going to do this, please remember to be safe. All right, let's talk about newsagents. I think they're called something else in the US and maybe in other parts of the world, but newsagents is where you buy your newspaper and your scratchies and cigarettes and magazines, that kind of place. I used to busk outside of there on weekend mornings. It was great because people would go there to get their morning newspaper and whatever. And people would just listen to my music while they were lining up to pay and then tip me on their way out. It always added up very quickly. Intersections. Now, this is an interesting one. If you play at an intersection where pedestrians are waiting to cross, that's an opportunity to grab people, because the more people are standing around listening to you play, the more time they have to decide if they're going to tip you or not, rather than them walking past quickly, and by the time they decide to tip you, they're already down the street. I found that in big cities, people want to just cross a street really quickly, but in smaller towns, people are less in a rush and more likely to tip you while they're waiting for the lights to turn green. Busking inside a business venue. This is the worst place to busk, and I strongly advise you do not do this. I took up an opportunity from a local brewery to busk inside their grounds. It was outside of the building. They kind of had like this yard that you walk through to get to the actual venue, and they were doing like a circus themed market, so there were stall holders selling things, and they asked me to busk there for a small retainer and a case of beer. I agreed to do it for 3 hours, and everyone just walked past me and ignored me. I don't know why. I think people might have believed I was paid entertainment. So they just weren't tipping me. It was the middle of the Australian summer. It was so hot. And after an hour of playing and getting like barely any tips, I just wanted to go home. But because I'd already told this venue I would do it for 3 hours, and you know, they'd picked me out of all the other people, I felt like it would potentially ruin my reputation and my relationship with that venue if I was to leave early. So I stuck it out and ended up making 13 Australian dollars for the 3 hours. It was a pretty bad experience, and I just felt used and really icky with the whole thing. So if I were to do that again, which I never would, but if you were considering doing it, make sure you have like a decent retainer, like something that actually makes it worth it if you don't get any tips, or have an agreement with the venue that if you don't make X amount of dollars by the first 60 minutes, then you're out, or they're paying you. Now, some other things to consider. Consider travel. If you're having to drive somewhere or pay for public transport, just think about the cost of fuel, the cost of the tickets, and weigh up how much money you're going to make based on what you've made before to decide whether or not it's going to be worth it. Also consider, once you've found the perfect busking location that you love, think about having another couple of spots just on rotation, just in case someone's in your spot, because chances are if it's a good spot for you, it's probably good for other people as well. And the first day when you go to busk and someone's there, you're just not going to know what to do, and it's going to feel like you've been, you know, ripped off by someone, when in reality no one owns any busking spot. Don't be that person that like sets up across the road and just drowns them out. I've had people do that to me before. It's just not nice. So have a few spots on rotation. Not only is it good just to have a backup plan, but it's also good to help you get exposure to other potential clients. A lot of people kind of stick to their routine and don't really break that routine very much. So if you're busking in the same spot every time, you're not going to cross paths with people that are doing their shopping somewhere else. So move it up a little bit and make sure you have business cards with you so people can grab your contact details without feeling like they're interrupting you. And also consider amplification if you're going to be playing somewhere loud, but make sure you check the laws. Are you actually allowed to play amplified? What are the rules around that? Anyway, guys, that's all the information I have to share with you about busking locations. If you have anything to contribute that I didn't think of in this video, please feel free to share it in the comments. Subscribe so you can be here for the next video. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Bye!